McCleary, President and CEO of the Los Angeles World Affairs Council and Town Hall. Thank you all for joining us, and thank you all for your ongoing support by viewing our live streams, by becoming members, and by making donations. We have a new donation platform that makes giving easier than ever. We'll showcase that just at the very end of this program. It'll just take a minute, and we hope you can pledge your support. We also have launched a sponsorship program for our 2020 election series that starts September 8th. Dan Schnur is going to be moderating several of those key programs, and we're offering sponsorships for the whole series to promote visibility for your company, or maybe recognize and honor an individual or an organization that you're proud of who has been making great contributions. So please go to our website at lawac.org and see how you can become a sponsor of our live streams. It's now my pleasure to introduce the best part of today's program, Politics in the Time of Coronavirus, with politics professor Dan Schnur. Dan, the news headlines they're really dull, so there's nothing for you to choose from today. But Dan, as always, has pivoted. So the lead today is Biden makes his pick, what Kamala Harris means for the presidential campaign. If we have time, we'll get to the Postal Service election, voting during a pandemic, and the battle for the post-Trump Republican Party. And all of you know the drill with respect to asking questions. You can type them in on the panel on the right-hand side, and Jessica will get to them as many of them as she can. Dan, I can't wait to get started, so I'm going to turn it over to you. So without further ado.
Well, Kim, thank you very much. And thanks to all of you for joining us today. There's no question. We do have a great deal of political news to cover, but of course, the most visible and the place where we're going to start is Joe Biden's decision to select California United States Senator Kamala Harris to be his running mate in this general election campaign. So before I start talking at all about what I think that might mean, Christina, why don't we right away go to our questions and let everybody weigh in with their own thoughts. So what we're going to ask you today is not whether you support Harris or not, whether you like her or not, but we want you to analyze what you think her impact will be on the fall campaign. So do you think Kamala Harris serving as Joe Biden's running mate, do you think that will, do you think it will help Biden a lot? Do you think it'll help him slightly? Do you think it will hurt Biden a lot? Do you think it would hurt him slightly? Or do you think Harris's selection will not have an impact very much one way or another? And so, Christina, when you have a chance, let's see the answers. Wow, look at that. 61% believe that Biden will be helped a lot by Harris's selection. Another 32% say slightly. So 93% of our respondents believe she's a benefit to the ticket. Nobody believes that Harris would hurt Biden a lot. A very small 4% thought that she would hurt him slightly. And 2% said that will not have an impact. So again, we weren't asking whether you are a supporter or an opponent of the selection, but rather whether you think it would help or hurt Biden. And our audience at least seems pretty conclusively to come down on the side that it's going to help him to some degree or to a larger degree, depending on our participant. So let's talk about this for a few minutes. And then as Kim mentioned, then Jessica and Jessica's back from her vacation this week, so we're excited to have her. And so once I've talked about this a little bit, we'll be interested in hearing your questions, not only about Harris's selection to the ticket, but more broadly, questions on where you think the campaign is headed at this point with only 82 days to go into Election Day. So let's start with the obvious. Kamala Harris has made history. She's the first woman of color ever to be named to a major party's national ticket. It is truly a historic breakthrough for the African-American community, but less noticed also for many members of the Asian Pacific community. Obviously, given her heritage, her mother comes from the country of India. So Harris will clearly help motivate the Democratic base. And we've been talking throughout this entire webinar series about Biden's challenge in motivating young voters and voters from minority communities. And it seems pretty clear that Harris will have a tremendous motivational effect on further encouraging turnout from voter groups that are very, very strongly predisposed against Donald Trump, but who haven't been all that excited about Joe Biden to date. Well, what's most interesting to me, and I'm guessing that most of you have read the news coverage and the analysis just as I have, but to me, it's what's really interesting is that it's a testament. It's a testament to how much the political world has changed and how much society has changed. That Kamala Harris, even given the historic breakthrough we just talked about, that Kamala Harris was considered to be Joe Biden's safest choice. Now, what do we mean by safe? So first of all, we tend to overestimate the impact of vice presidential candidates to begin with. I would argue to you that in the last half a century, there have only been two running mates that have made much of a difference in the presidential campaign at all. Those two were Thomas Eagleton in 1972 and Sarah Palin in 2008. And neither of them, even though they both made an impact, neither made it for the benefit of their party, which means you probably need to go all the way back to 1960, 60 years, to find the last vice presidential selection who had a material positive impact on the ticket. And that was, of course, Lyndon Johnson, who helped JFK carry Texas in that election, Johnson's home state, and also opened up other southern states to Kennedy that might not have otherwise been available to him. But maybe we should agree that a phenomenon that occurs once every 60 years can be classified as an exception rather than the rule. So one, we don't think there's going to be a great difference. I don't think there's going to be a great difference made by Harris's place on the ticket, although she will motivate turnout in the way we discussed otherwise. But let's go on, because while Biden did consider other candidates, he had ruled out what I guess we could call the more traditional safe choices. Who's the more traditional safe choice? Well, white men are a traditional safe choice. And as you know, Biden had pledged some months ago that he would select a female running mate. So that meant that all white men and all male potential running mates were out. It's also been clear since the death of George Floyd, in the dialogue on race relations that's taken place since then, has meant that there'd be a lot of pressure and a very heightened expectations that Biden would not just choose a female running mate, but would choose a candidate who's African American, Latina, or of Asian Pacific heritage. And that meant that white female candidates like Senators Elizabeth Warren or Tammy Baldwin of Wisconsin, and governors like Gretchen Whitmer of Michigan and Gina Raimondo of Rhode Island would probably not be his selection given the political landscape as it currently exists. Now, Biden had also said, in addition to his intent to name a female running mate, he'd also made it clear appropriately that he would want a running mate who would possess the experience to assume the presidency if necessary. In other words, this is not a position for growth. He needed someone based on his own experience with Barack Obama, and to be frank, his age, to have someone who'd be ready from day one to ascend to the presidency if necessary. Now, in modern political history, that experience has been defined in a very specific way. The political community tends to judge governors and United States senators as having that requisite experience. And so while Biden could have pushed that envelope, it seemed unlikely that he would pick someone who did not hold or had once held one of those two positions. As it stands, Kamala Harris is currently the only African American woman in the United States of America who holds either of those two positions. She is only the second African American woman ever to be a United States senator. And in our nation's history, no African American woman has ever been the governor of a state. Now, there are a handful of other women of color who do hold those offices. Catherine Cortez Masto of Nevada, the United States senator from that state, withdrew her name from consideration this spring. Governor Michelle Lujan Grisham of New Mexico, who, like Cortez Masto, is Latina, she was reportedly much more seriously considered than most of the speculative news stories had implied over the last several weeks. It sounds like she was much closer to being selected than was commonly believed. And Senator Tammy Duckworth of Illinois, who's of Asian Pacific descent, was apparently one of a small number of finalists as well. But on this landscape, in the aftermath of the death of Mr. Floyd, the Black Lives Matter conversation, and all the other changes to our political landscape over the last several months, it seemed that while the nomination of a Latina or Asian Pacific candidate would have been just as historic, that national debate over race relations that's taken place over the months had created an environment for Biden where an African-American nominee would have much more of a motivational effect than one of the other alternatives. So who were the other African-American women under consideration? Well, there were several, but they all brought risks of their own. In retrospect, greater risks than Harris had presented. Representative Karen Bass of here in Los Angeles. Representative Bass is very well thought of by leaders in both parties. But over the course of the years, she's made a number of positive comments about the late Fidel Castro. And given the critical importance of the state of Florida and the Cuban American vote in that state, it seemed like that would have been a pretty big gamble for Biden to take. The former National Security Advisor, Susan Rice, is somebody who reportedly Biden thought very highly of, given their work together in the Obama administration. But while Rice, too, is very well thought of and very admired, she's never run for public office before. And to take someone who's never run for office at any level and put them under the national spotlight of a presidential campaign, there is no indication that she wouldn't have been able to handle that kind of scrutiny. But once again, it's a pretty big gamble. And given the level of experience that Biden made it clear that he expected from his running mate, would have made it very difficult for him to select Representative Val Demings of Florida, Mayor Keisha Lance Bottoms of Atlanta, or former Georgia State Legislator Stacey Abrams of having the experience to hold the job. So, all of which is to say that if Biden wanted a candidate with both acceptable presidential level experience and credibility and sufficient motivational capacity, his pool of candidates was exactly one person, and that one person is Senator Kamala Harris. So Biden decided to opt for caution, which is a luxury that's available to frontrunners. And Biden continues to hold a sizable lead in the polls, although it is worth noting that it has shrunk slightly, his lead over Donald Trump over the last few weeks. But as the frontrunner, he opted for caution. And that leads us to one last historical note, which I would argue might be the most important of all. Now, as we know, Kamala Harris is not the first woman to be named to a national ticket. There were two who preceded her. But both Geraldine Ferraro and Sarah Palin were both chosen by presidential candidates who were running well behind in the polls. Both Walter Mondale, when he picked Ferraro in 1984, and John McCain, when he selected Palin in 2008, they were both running well behind their opponents. Both of them had to take a gamble. You could argue that neither of them had anything to lose. And so what that means is that Kamala Harris is the first woman in our country's history to be selected for a position on a national ticket, not out of weakness or desperation, but out of confidence and strength. And I think that regardless of how one plans to vote in November, that's a breakthrough that's worth noting and worth savoring. Now, before we move on to our second topic, because we do have other topics we've outlined for today, there's one other thing worth covering as it relates to Harris's selection, and that's the question of ideology. One of the greatest challenges that Harris ran into during her own presidential campaign is that primary voters didn't really know where to place her. She was progressive, but not as progressive as Bernie Sanders or Elizabeth Warren. In other areas, she was centrist, but not as centrist as Joe Biden and Pete Buttigieg in other and other candidates. So while she's seen as being to the left of Biden, she certainly doesn't necessarily represent the most progressive voices at the base of the Democratic Party. So once again, a safe choice. Not too center, not too left. And that raises, it seems to me, a question about the long-term trajectory and direction of the Democratic Party. Last week, you may remember, we asked all of you if we thought this fall, if in this election, if you thought Democrats should prioritize liberal issues to motivate their party's base, or centrist issues to appeal to swing voters as an election strategy this fall in particular. And your responses by a pretty strong margin said that you thought the Democrats this fall ought to be emphasizing more of a centrist approach. And so let's talk for a minute, though. I'm going to ask you that same question again, but with a twist. Joe Biden has referred to himself as a transitional figure toward his party's future. So, Christina, if we can put up the second question. Thinking about the Democratic future, the future of the Democratic Party beyond November, what do you think the party ought to be prioritizing? Not in terms of winning this upcoming election, but over the long haul as they move into the future. Should the Democratic Party be emphasizing liberal and progressive goals to motivate the party base? Or alternatively, should the Democratic Party coming out of the 2020 election and moving forward into the future instead prioritize center-left issues to reach voters in the middle of the political spectrum? So we got your short-term answers last week. Let's see now what our group thinks this week. Okay, so this is really interesting. 32%, roughly 1/3, said the party should veer to the left and emphasize issues to appeal to the progressive party base. 68%, more than 2/3, still believe that not just as an election strategy this fall, but for the long-term health and presumably success of the Democratic Party, the party should continue on a center-left path. So very, very interesting. Let's do this. We spent a little bit more time on this topic than we normally do, given the obvious import of the news. But let's move on to the second topic, and let's switch to the Republicans. Now, while Kamala Harris has been attracting all of this interest and all this excitement over the last couple of days, and let's assume that that will continue in terms of an outsized media presence for her and for Biden over the course of next week throughout the Democratic National Convention. Think for a minute about Donald Trump sitting on the sidelines, watching somebody else hogging what he considers to be his spotlight. Now, we know, and we've talked about this before, that Trump believes that the best way to win an argument is to dominate the audience's attention. And so through the course of his first campaign for president and through the course of his presidency, he believes he is most successful when he occupies center stage. And now that Joe Biden has gone and named a woman of color to be his running mate for the first time in our nation's history, Donald Trump doesn't have that center stage to himself the way he normally would. And he might not be handling it all that well. And so my guess is that President Trump has been watching all the attention and excitement that Harris is generating, and he wants that spotlight back. So we've talked about this in the past every now and then. But the question arises, and I'm not predicting this, I'm simply just asking. Given Trump's interest, and eagerness to steal the spotlight back from the Democrats, would he, heading into the Republican convention, would Trump switch running mates in order to generate some additional attention and excitement of his own? And in particular, would he name a woman, and perhaps a woman of color, to be his running mate, to some degree undermine the level of interest and enthusiasm that Harris is currently attracting? Now, Mike Pence, as we've talked about before, has been a very loyal vice president to Donald Trump. And during their campaign together 4 years ago, Pence was instrumental in convincing evangelical and fundamentalist and other religious conservative voters to put their trust in Trump and ultimately to vote for him. But over the last 4 years, The president has developed his own relationship with those religious conservative voters. They've watched his judicial statements, they've watched his pronouncements on abortion and other social and cultural issues, and they're more comfortable with him now than they were when he was more of an unknown quantity back in the 2016 campaign. So the question for Donald Trump is he loyal to Mike Pence? Haha, just kidding. The question for Donald Trump is, does the stability of keeping Mike Pence on the ticket outweigh the benefits of replacing him? And of course, and I think all of you have gathered by now who I'm talking about, there's been speculation for the last couple of years about the political future of former United Nations Ambassador Nikki Haley, also of Indian descent, and whether she would run for president someday. And so again, I never make predictions when it comes to Donald Trump, but knowing how much he enjoys the spotlight and knowing how much he enjoys dominating public attention, I have to believe that over the next several days, he will very seriously consider at least the possibility of putting Haley on the ticket instead of the current Vice President Pence. Now, Nikki Haley isn't the only high-profile Republican woman in the country. The New York Times reported last week that the governor of South Dakota, Kristi Noem, flew to Washington, D.C. recently to reassure Pence that she was not angling for his spot on the ticket. But the fact that there was so much speculation of it has to make you wonder whether this is something that either the president or people close to him are considering. What we're probably not going to be able to do today, and we'll need to come back to another time, is to talk more, as we'd advertised, about the longer-term future of the Republican Party and whether the post-Trump party will turn to a more traditional conservative, like Marco Rubio or Ted Cruz, possibly Ben Sasse, the senator from Nebraska, or has the party been so fundamentally remade by Trump that a conservative of his, with his ideological grounding, Tom Cotton, the senator from Arkansas, Josh Hawley, the senator from Missouri, Donald Trump Jr., would any of them represent the direction that a Trumpified Republican Party would prefer to go? And of course, we do have Vice President Pence, who on one hand is an heir to Donald Trump in all sorts of ways, but on the other hand represents the more traditional wing of the party as well. So that's a conversation that we can either come back to and question and answer today if you'd like, or in a future week. But given the news about Harris, we're probably not spending quite as much time on it today as we'd planned. Lastly, and very quickly, and in just a moment or two, Jessica and I will be eager to hear your questions, and I'll do my best to answer them. The other topic that we are advertised in advance this week was the question of voting by mail. And that is one that, again, we'll have to probably have a more detailed conversation on in the future. But a couple things worth noting there very quickly. For those of you who haven't seen the news this morning, Donald Trump announced just this morning in a television interview that he would oppose any money at all in the COVID relief bill being used for the Postal Service. And that directly contradicts what his representatives in the negotiations had been saying to date. But not only did Trump say that there would be no money in the COVID bill for the Postal Service, he also made it very clear that he linked additional funding for the Postal Service, for the Post Office, linked that funding to the Post Office's ability to conduct broader mail voting this fall. He made it clear once again that he believes mail voting will lead to fraud and will help Democratic candidates, but he was very explicit that if his COVID bill doesn't have money for the Postal Service in it, then we can't expand mail voting to the degree that many would like this fall. Now that is a very serious assertion, and we'll find out more in the days and weeks ahead whether it's one that he intends to stick with. But just a couple of background points to keep in mind is that aspect of the COVID negotiations moves forward. Without additional money from Congress, the Post Office would be forced to treat political mail, including ballots, not as first-class mail, which has always been the case in the past, but rather as third-class mail. Now, third-class mail gets delivered for 20 cents rather than for 55 cents, which would realize a considerable cost savings. But of course, the biggest difference between first and third class mail is a first class piece of mail gets delivered almost always within 2 to 5 days. Third class mail usually gets delivered, can be as much as 10 days before it's delivered. So if this circumstance holds, and if Trump continues to insist that he will not fund mail balloting, the practical impact of that will mean that all those Americans thinking about voting for mail can still do so, but they will need to do it further in advance of the election. Polls show that 72% of Democrats say that they are very or somewhat likely to vote by mail this year, compared with 22% of Republicans. Now, to some degree, that's a self-fulfilling prophecy because Trump has warned over the months about what he feels are the dangers of mail voting. But it's clear that he does see, given poll numbers like that, a partisan benefit to mail voting becoming more difficult rather than easier. I don't suspect this is the kind of argument that Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer will give up without a fight. And so we will set aside more time for this conversation in future weeks. But news of the day is that at least right now, Trump says no additional money for the post office, which doesn't mean that mail voting can't be done. It just means that those who intend to vote by mail will need to make an extra effort to do it early. And quick note for those of you in California, know that here in our state, ballots can be received as much as 17 full days after the election and still count. But if you're in other states, the rules aren't quite as forgiving. And so for those of you who do think about voting for mail, by mail, obviously doing it earlier rather than later this year is the smarter and safer thing to do. We also have in the morning news a historic agreement between Israel and the United Arab Emirates, who agreed to normalize relations between those two countries, only the third Arab country with which Israel will have diplomatic relations. I'd suggest to you there's more than meets the eye there diplomatically, but less than meets the eye there in terms of domestic American politics. But that's a topic we'll have to talk about again at some point in the future. Jessica, I kept you waiting long enough. We've covered a lot of ground, but what do you and what do our audience members want to talk about for the balance of our time?
Everything. So we will jump right into it.
We'll have to hurry.
Yeah. All right. The first question, what is Harris's biggest liability to Biden?
Harris's biggest liability to Biden, I think, largely depends on when and how the Trump campaign ultimately settles on the best way to criticize her. In the first day or two after she was named, Republicans were really all over the map. Some said she was too liberal. Some said that she should be a disappointment to liberals. And they're trying all sorts of different things, trying to figure out what sticks. My guess, and it's just a guess, is because of the emphasis that Trump has been putting on the law and order issue, seeing it as a way to win back both older voters and suburban voters, that's going to be the criticism that they level against Harris. And while ironically, Harris was criticized heavily in the Democratic primary for being too, quote unquote, tough on crime, it's entirely reasonable to expect that the Trump campaign and the Republican Party will criticize her just as harshly for not being nearly strong enough on public safety issues. And in particular, when Harris was the district attorney in San Francisco, she declined to seek the death penalty for a man who had killed a police officer. The police officer's name was Isaac Espinosa. And I don't like to make predictions, as all of you know, but I'll make you this one. That in the next 82 days, the name Isaac Espinosa is going to resonate throughout the political discussion to a tremendous degree, not necessarily here in California, but nationally. And so I think with the swing voters who Trump needs to win back in order to have a chance of getting elected, the fact that Harris is soft on crime and talking about issues like her decision in the Espinosa case is something that could create some potential vulnerability for the ticket, particularly in the key Midwestern states.
Do you think any of her comments during the debate where she was calling out Biden for the busing and basically almost calling him racist, do you think that's going to come back? I mean, I'm assuming the Trump campaign will probably use that.
I suspect they will, because that's what presidential campaigns in both parties always do. When a presidential candidate names a running mate who he or she had run against in a primary, they disagreed on things. That's what primaries are for. And sort of predictable that the other side will say, oh, ho, ho, look, they disagreed on this last year. George H.W. Bush, in his primary against Ronald Reagan, referred to Reagan's economic agenda as, quote unquote, voodoo economics. Lyndon Johnson said some extremely harsh things about JFK before he was named the ticket. I think most voters will see the fact that Harris and Biden have disagreed in the past as politicians being politicians. And while it will become part of the conversation, or continue to be part of the conversation, Jessica, I don't know that it's going to change any votes.
In your Jewish Journal article, you referred to Kamala Harris as an African American. Do you believe this is a technically correct description, given that her father is of Jamaican ancestry? And do you think that makes any real world difference?
Yes and no. I should have been more precise, both in today's webinar, but also in my writing. Just as calling Barack Obama an African American is not a completely accurate term. Harris has an extremely unique demographic makeup. Her father, as the questioner noted correctly, is from Jamaica. Her mother's from India. She, over the years, has identified herself as an African American, but she's also indicated how proud she is of her Indo-American heritage. The fact remains that she is a woman of color, and regardless of how you break that down in terms of more specific descriptions, this is a historic breakthrough, and I think does have great motivational potential for the base of the Democratic Party in the general election. But the questioner is exactly right. I do need to be more precise. And while every time I refer to her, I don't think I'll take the time to reference both her Jamaican father and her Indian mother. But in a longer conversation like this one, it is worth making that extra effort, if nothing else, out of respect to her parents.
Yes. How will Kamala Harris's race and gender impact the campaign rhetoric?
Well, we're already seeing indications from the president and his supporters that they're not going to be particularly shy about using very gender-specific language in their criticisms, in their attacks of her. I haven't seen anything yet. That doesn't mean it hasn't taken place, but I haven't seen anything over the last 36 hours that has indicated race-based invective. I suspect that will come just because there are irresponsible voices throughout the body politic who traffic in such things. But there's no question that a large dose of the criticism she faces will come with a heavily gender-based component to it. And whether an individual determines that that criticism is misogyny on one hand, or just a legitimate criticism that would be made of either a female or male candidate, probably tells us more about that voter than it does about the criticism. If you like Trump, it's fair game. If you don't like him, then it's sexist or misogynistic. But there will be no shortage of it, and we're already seeing strong evidence of it just in the first couple of days of her place since she was named to the ticket.
Thank you. Trump is clearly flailing around looking for a consistent, powerful strategy and message after the Harris pick and towards Biden in general. If Trump called you, Dan, and said he would take your advice, what's the strategy/message that might give Trump a shot at winning at this point?
If that's a really big if, I think we can agree. I always used to like to say, if my grandma had wheels, she'd be a bicycle. But I'll humor the questioner and give it my best shot. First of all, as I've told all of you many times before, I am a no party preference voter, and just as in the classroom, where I don't think my personal political leanings are appropriate to share, I'm not sharing them here. So answering the question that was put to me is not something that anyone should translate into my support for the president, just as anybody listening to this really tortured precursor shouldn't interpret it into opposition. I don't take sides on camera. But if I were to decide that Donald Trump should be reelected, and if he were to call me to ask for my advice, God, if of those magnitude are almost dizzying, I would tell him that the law and order issue is probably his best last hope to win back those swing voters. Continuing and accelerating his attacks on China, not just for the coronavirus, but on any number of economic and human rights and national security issues, would complement that law and order message. But I think those would be the two tiers of a communication strategy that would allow Trump to attract swing voters, and his continued messaging on social and cultural issues and judicial appointments become the key to motivating his base. And yes, if you were asking, I'd say, and can you please give Clarence Thomas a call and ask him to step down so that Mitch McConnell can rush through a Supreme Court nomination at some point between now and Election Day too. So given all those ifs, that's the best I got.
Very good. Well, if that happens, you have to put it on a webinar and we're all going to watch.
I promise.
Thank you. All right. If Biden and Harris win the election, what can they possibly do to reverse the public's perception of the pandemic and the public's opposition to being vaccinated when a vaccine is made available?
I don't think public perception would be the biggest challenge for a new president and vice president, at least not compared to the real world necessities and obstacles of steering the country through the pandemic and its aftermath. We can talk at another time, as we have in the past, about what those substantive steps would need to be in terms of social distancing, in terms of more aggressive testing and tracing, and in terms of vaccine distribution. But in terms of messaging, I believe that the American public will be predisposed to listen to a new president on this issue. By definition, every new president of either party gets a honeymoon period. It's rare in our nation's history that the stakes of that honeymoon period would be so high. But I do believe that a new president would have a platform from which to be heard, and would be, and his public messaging, I think, would be followed, maybe not on all issues, maybe not on taxes or immigration or climate change, but I think even a large percentage of Trump voters would listen on COVID-related direction from a Biden White House. And I also suspect that Biden would very aggressively reach out to Republican governors and senators and employ their help in delivering that message. So whether it's social distancing, masks, and other type of behavior, whether it's cooperating in terms of testing and tracing, and ultimately vaccine distribution, my hope would be is that a Democratic president would understand that in such a highly polarized time, he would need to recruit large numbers of Republican voices, albeit more traditional conservative voices, to help amplify that message among communities that had voted for Trump's reelection.
Thank you. What would the schedule be for Trump to pick a new vice president, possibly Nikki Haley? Would it have to be right before the convention, or what is the schedule?
Well, technically, the reason these conventions exist is to nominate a president and a vice presidential candidate, the nominees of their party. So while it would technically be possible for Trump to replace Pence on the ticket post-convention, logistically, it would be very, very difficult. If such a thing were going to happen, and I should make it more clear than I did earlier, I think the odds are against it. But if Trump is sitting and watching television and seeing all this coverage and attention that Harris is getting and decides that he wants to win it back, he essentially has until the final night of the Republican National Convention, which is 2 weeks from tonight, in order to make that happen in a relatively, and emphasize the word relatively, easy way. So yeah, he's got 13 days.
All right, well, hopefully he can make it happen. If you're Gavin Newsom,
I'll tell him that.
Yeah. If you're Gavin Newsom, what are your biggest considerations in appointing Harris's successor to the Senate? And also, I mean, it could be Senator Feinstein too. She's obviously considering potentially stepping down in the coming years. And who do you think are the most likely pick possibilities, and who aren't?
Well, a reporter asked Gavin Newsom yesterday if people had been approaching him to pitch themselves for the Senate seat. And Newsom's response was, You're the only person I've talked to who hasn't. There are no shortage of ambitious Democratic politicians around the state, which is just fine. And the question is a smart one, because not only may Newsom be in a position to appoint Harris's successor, but while I think Feinstein, given her druthers, would serve out her term until 2024, it's entirely possible, given her age, that she may decide that finishing her term is something she chooses not to do. A couple of thoughts on Newsom, or to get to the first of the two questions. What does a governor look for when they make a selection like this? They look for someone who's loyal to them, and they look for someone who can probably win the next election, because that senator will only hold the seat, the appointed senator will only hold the seat until November of 2022. And for a governor to appoint a new senator who then leaves office a couple years later, you didn't get much out of it. Way back in the day when Pete Wilson appointed a Republican state legislator by the name of John Seymour, who ironically enough lost to Dianne Feinstein when she first became a senator, Wilson didn't get nearly as much out of that pick. Why? Because his appointee was only in office for 2 years, as opposed to a full 6 or longer. Newsom, the speculation is, will be looking to make some history with his pick. And there's a lot of pressure on him to pick a Latino or a Latina senator. The state of California has never had a Hispanic American represent us in the United States Senate. There's also pressure on him to select another African American woman to take Harris's place, since she is now the only African American woman in the United States Senate. If I had to guess, though, I would say that Newsom is most likely to choose someone who currently holds statewide office, because if he were to appoint another constitutional officer, then Newsom would also get to appoint that person's replacement. So let's say, for the sake of argument, that Newsom were to appoint the Secretary of State, Alex Padilla, or the Attorney General, Javier Becerra. Not only would he be appointing a United States Senator, but then you get to appoint the next Secretary of State and the next Attorney General as well. So while there's no shortage of qualified members of Congress or local elected office holders from around the state, I suspect if you look at the 7 men and women who hold constitutional office in California other than Newsom, that's probably the list from which his ultimate selection is going to come.
Well, I can confirm that some of our members have already nominated you for the position in the question. So there you go.
I think I am a little bit, only slightly more likely for Newsom to appoint me than I am for Donald Trump to ask me for advice, but thank you.
How does the current Democratic lead compare with the same time 4 years ago?
Biden's lead at this point is slightly, and only slightly larger than Clinton's. The biggest difference is in approval ratings. Clinton never, after the early stages of the primary, never received more than 50% of the vote in public opinion polling, or had a 50% or higher approval rating. So while Biden's head-to-head lead over Trump is only slightly larger than Clinton's, his overall approval numbers and the level of his support is somewhat higher than hers. But it's a smart question, because while we've become somewhat accustomed over the last few months to Biden building a fairly sizable lead in the polls, new polling this week in the states of Pennsylvania and Wisconsin, both swing states, show Biden with about a 6-point lead. And of course, you'd always rather be 6 points ahead than 6 points behind. But while that's a decent size lead, it's not a safe one by any means. And with 82 days to go, the questioner is right to be thinking about 2016, and in particular, Trump's ability to motivate his base to turn out in outsized numbers, particularly in those key swing states.
Thank you. Several people are asking about, what about people being able to drop off ballots at specific locations, like at their polling destination? So is that something that's being explored?
So every state has different rules on this, and I know most of, not all of, but most of our audience is in California. And you may remember in the primary that the state has now begun to experiment with so-called election centers, which allow individuals to drop off ballots in the not just the days, but the weeks before the election. Different counties have slightly different rules. And so in addition to going on your county registrar's office to check for the locations of those election centers, it's also a good idea to check to see what days your county will have those centers available to you. But even if the Postal Service were being fully funded, even if Trump had not made the threat that he did this morning, dropping off the ballot in person, while potentially risky from a health standpoint, is a safer path to take. Even if every elected official in both parties in every state in the country were truly, madly, deeply committed to a vote-by-mail election working as smoothly and seamlessly as possible, most states in the country just simply don't have the infrastructure for the incredibly large number of mail ballots that they're going to receive this year. And so dropping it off through early voting, I think, is the smartest and safest way to go, unless leaving your house is just simply not something you're comfortable doing.
I've also thought about the fact that in speaking to people at LA County or at the city, half the employees are in, half of them are out. They're having to do alternating days. And so trying to deal with that communication piece around such a big project for an election it just creates a layer of complication.
Yeah, I mean, for all the talk, and I know there are people who regularly participate in this webinar who don't agree with me on this because I've heard from them, but for all the talk about voter suppression, there's a relatively small number of examples in this country where someone is absolutely completely denied the right to vote if they truly possessed it. The term voter suppression generally gets used a little bit more broadly to talk about efforts to make it very difficult to vote. And so generally speaking, whether it's other obstacles or whether it's the challenge of a largely mail election, the way to overcome these obstacles is to do it early. Don't wait till the last minute. And I know that means there might be late breaking news, not just in the campaign for president, but in a local race or a ballot initiative that you want to have, for which you want to have access. But I'd strongly, strongly encourage all of you, regardless of whom you tend to vote for this fall, whether it's Biden, whether it's Trump, whether it's Kanye, whoever it happens to be, vote early in order to relieve the stress on the system. And not only is that going to dramatically increase the likelihood that your vote gets counted the way it deserves to, but it is going to relieve some stress on the system in the days leading up to and immediately after the election. So sooner really is better.
Thank you. Since you mentioned Kanye, is the Republican Party pushing Kanye West as a spoiler?
It appears so. There's, as we've talked about before, Kanye West, according to his wife, is struggling with some very difficult issues, and I'm not in a position to judge whether his candidacy is a reflection of those struggles or not. But it does appear that if not an organized national effort, of which there is none, but there is evidence that Republican operatives in a number of states are making efforts to help West qualify for the ballot. He will not qualify in all 50 states. He won't even qualify in enough states to get 270 electoral votes. But he doesn't need to, because if he gets 2-3% of the vote in a few swing states, that certainly doesn't guarantee anything in terms of an outcome. But it's an added benefit to President Trump. I mentioned a few minutes ago, Jessica, as you remember, that Biden is generally seeing higher favorability numbers and attracting a larger share of the vote than Clinton did, even though his margin is not larger. Well, the reason is we all know that Trump won, even with lower approval ratings, is because third and fourth party candidates siphoned off some of the vote that likely would have gone to Clinton. The Green Party and the Libertarian candidates this year don't seem in a position to attract as much support as Johnson and Stein did in 2016. But if West can pull off even some votes The supposition, and it's a debatable one, but the supposition is that if West got even a small number of votes, that they would come disproportionately from African-American voters. That's based on all sort of assumptions that I'm not completely comfortable with, but let's just stay there for the moment. But even if small numbers of African-American voters who would otherwise support Joe Biden voted for Kanye West in very closely contested swing states, that is a potential issue. And the fact that Mr. West, if I may call him that, has apparently been in conversations with the president's son-in-law reinforces the suspicion that if not the president himself, people around him don't necessarily see Kanye West as a key to the president's reelection, but certainly something that might be able to help a little bit in some key places.
Thank you. When does California start counting absentee ballots? And somebody said, just to confirm that the best tactic to take it is to mail in our ballot as soon as we get it after October 5th. So
my advice would actually be to go to one of the election centers. And for those of you in states other than California, if you're in that there are 39 of the 50 states allow for some type of early pre-election day voting. That's your best bet, regardless of where you are. If you don't feel comfortable leaving the house to vote early or to visit one of these voting centers, then I would say the sooner you get your ballot, the better. Interesting, the state of North Carolina is the first state in the country to send out its mail ballots. Those ballots, if you can believe it, go out in less than 3 weeks. And so the very first American voters will be in a position to cast ballots in 19 days' time. A couple weeks after that, Pennsylvania and Michigan start sending out their ballots. And so California comes a little bit later. But in most states, the ballots do not begin to get counted. The absentee ballots or the mail ballots do not begin to get counted until after the polls have closed on election night. That's why it takes so much time for the results to come in our state, because we don't start counting those ballots when they arrive. But I would say once again that even if your vote's not going to be counted until the night of November 3rd or in the days following, the sooner you get it in, the better you are. And if it's something you can safely do in person rather than by mail, I think that's an added precaution that's worth taking.
Okay, thank you. This questioner says, I'm surprised to hear you refer to Donald Trump's ideology. He doesn't seem to have any fixed ideas as he constantly contradicts himself. Please explain what you think his conservative ideology is.
Well, Trump is conservative on some issues. He has become over the years a fairly traditional conservative on most social and cultural matters. But economically and in terms of international policy, the questioner is exactly right. Trump's ideology does not resemble traditional conservatism. We don't have the time for a longer semantic discussion of the terms conservative and liberal. I could get wrapped around the axle on that pretty quickly. But so I guess the verbal shorthand I've used in the past is to talk about traditional Republican conservatism. And the examples I use today are people like Rubio and Cruz. You could go back to Romney and McCain and Bush and others. On one hand, talking about traditional Republican conservatives versus Trump conservatives. And these are the Hawleys and the Cottons and the other peoples I've mentioned. But the questioner is right. Simply calling it Trump conservatism does not make it conservatism. And a more isolationist foreign policy, a suspicion of trade agreements, a comfort level with deficit spending, and many other issues all veer dramatically from traditional conservatism. My own opinion, not taking sides in the race, of course, is I think it's worth noting that Donald Trump was not a Republican for much of his adult life. He spent some time in the Democratic Party and is an independent as well. I think in spirit, he really is much more of an independent than a Republican. And some years ago, simply saw, if you'll allow me to use the term, I think he simply saw a takeover opportunity that in a Republican Party that was more vulnerable and ideologically exposed than the Democratic Party was. And I think Trump either intentionally or more likely intuitively understood the growing ideological divide between Republican Party leaders and the Republican grassroots, and stepped in and exploited those differences for his own benefit in 2016, much to the way that, in the same way that Bernie Sanders understood and exploited those differences between the Democratic Party establishment and a growing part of the grassroots base in his party. But once again, the questioner is right to call me out. Referring to this as Trump conservatism is dramatically oversimplifying the president's ideological makeup.
Thank you. What do you make of John Kasich speaking at the DNC?
John Kasich, the Republican former governor of Ohio and former Republican congressman, is speaking to the Democratic National Committee. It's not a convention. It's not unprecedented, by the way. When George W. Bush was renominated by the Republican Party in 2004, former Democratic governor of Georgia spoke at the convention, and in both cases, Governor Miller then and Governor Kasich now, it's an effort on behalf of the party to demonstrate to voters from the other party that it's okay to cross over. Kasich, of course, has been an outspoken Trump critic for some time now, and his presence on the first night of the convention, interestingly enough, speaking the same night as Bernie Sanders under the broader theme of unity, is the Democrats, number one, appealing to those Republicans who are not Trump supporters, but also attempting to reassure other centrist voters that their concerns about Trump don't automatically make them extremely progressive. So it's not a really big deal from a broader perspective, but for some key swing voters in heavily contested states, Kasich's participation could be very, very helpful for Biden.
Thank you. This questioner says, has there ever been a luckier presidential candidate than Joe Biden, given how he was doing before the pandemic/recession, and what's happened since? Honest question.
Well, I'm not qualified to rank the luck of presidential candidates, but I would simply say that any man or someday woman who gets elected president of the United States has to have a lot of breaks go their way along the way, including Donald Trump. Barack Obama's primary campaign against Hillary Clinton, the specifics of the 2000 Bush-Gore campaign, there's no shortage of presidents who can attribute at least some of their successes on fortune smiling on them. But the premise underneath the question, I think, is a smart one, which, if I can rephrase it, is, did COVID-19 win the election for Joe Biden? And while I think that's somewhat exaggerated, there's no question it's been of tremendous benefit to Biden. Because before the pandemic hit this country, along with all the other disruptions that the virus has caused all of us, it's caused incredible, extraordinary, unprecedented economic disruption. And there's no question that if Donald Trump were running for re-election on the basis of a strong and growing economy, he would be in a much better place now than talking about an economy that succeeded once and therefore he can bring it back again. One quick note on this, Jessica, and then hopefully we can get in one last question. In addition to the economic disruption, there's cultural disruption, which works to Biden's benefit as well. In my own opinion, is that the most overlooked political story of the week is the decision of the Pacific 12 and the Big Ten athletic conferences to decide to cancel their fall seasons, including college football. I think it's worth assuming, despite their protestations, that the other conferences will end up following and canceling as well. And it's really hard to describe to people who have not lived in the Midwestern or Southern United States exactly how important the Friday night high school football, the Saturday afternoon college football, and the Sunday morning church services are to the rhythm and the sense of normalcy and tradition in many communities, particularly those communities where Trump has succeeded. And so the questioner's thinking on this is exactly right. Whether Joe Biden deserves to be president or not is for each and every one of you to decide. But he has clearly been helped by the pandemic, if only because of how badly Trump has been hurt by it.
All right. Will having Senator Harris on the ballot have any effect on the down ballot voting, such as the House candidates?
But also a good question. Will Harris be able to help Biden elect more House, or for that matter, Senate Democrats? And the answer is, I don't think so. I think while Harris can be a motivational candidate, a presence for the party base, I don't know that a lot of voters will consciously make the decision to cast their ballot for a particular congressional or Senate candidate because of Harris's place on the ticket, in the sense that more Democratic voters help all Democratic candidates, then I suppose she has an indirect impact. But beyond that, I don't see her being picked, as opposed to Susan Rice or Karen Bass or Elizabeth Warren, having much of an impact on what the House and Senate will look like the day after the election.
Thank you so much. Well, I know we're right at the end of the hour, so I'm going to turn this conversation over to Kim. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Jessica, thank you. Great job as always. Dan, I'm on the edge of my seat. I'm going to be biting my nails down to the countdown of this election. So glad we have you to guide us through this.
Well, of course, Kim, the great thing for us in terms of timing, and I think it's accidental, but you might have done it intentionally, is of course, because we're doing this Thursday morning, next week we'll be talking the morning of Joe Biden's acceptance speech at the Democratic National Convention. And the Thursday after that, we'll be talking the morning of Donald Trump's acceptance speech at the Republican National Convention.
Of course, we planned that perfectly.
Nicely done. Very good job, Kim.
For those of you who love Dan's series and want to help us keep this quality program going, please type the word Schnur, S-C-H-N-U-R, to a phone number that will be appearing on the screen shortly. It's through Zoom Giving. There you go, S-C-H-N-U-R. Please type it to that name. We really need your help to keep this going. So thank you so much. Next week, we have two great programs, a members only program on Monday featuring Dan Eberhardt, who's the CEO of Canary LLC, who will be talking about the U.S. energy sector, where it is now, where it's going, what to expect. And of course, on August 19th, we have Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy. So go to our website at lawac.org and register today. Please, everybody, stay safe, stay informed. And remember, we'll see all of you back next Thursday for Dan's Politics in the Time of Coronavirus. Dan, thanks again.
Everyone. See you next week.
Take care.